Our lecturer tonight he's blessed us a few times. He's blessed us with what I think is one of the most outstanding exposés of the life of G.K. Chesterton, something I've listened to over and over again. And last year gave a lecture on Gerard Manley Hopkins that, well, it hit it further out of the ballpark than Bo Jackson. It was good stuff, Steve. Some of the best stuff. Tonight he is going to, bless us with a lecture on the life and work of Flannery O'Connor. And so I would like to introduce Steve to those of you who don't know him. He did his graduate studies at Regent College in Vancouver and works in the publishing industry and has 25 years experience as a dealer of rare and antiquarian books. He is remembered fondly by this crowd for his captivating delivery of the life of G.K. Chesterton and his magnificent recitation of Chesterton's Lepanto when these lectures began a little over 2 years ago. It's a great joy to have him back and to bless us with another lecture that I know will be outstanding. So let's put it together and please welcome back Mr. Steve Ayers.
I am not a mystic, Flannery O'Connor writes in a letter in 1955, and I do not lead a holy life. She would appear to be just as modest about how she sees herself in her vocation as a writer. To the same correspondent, a week later she writes, I am only a storyteller. Time would confirm the precision of storyteller, but has emphatically corrected her modesty in the use of the word only. She stands today among the most perdurable writers of novels and short stories in the last 100 years, her fame resting securely on her incendiary originality and stylistic precision, and what a reviewer of her first novel in Time magazine characterized as a brutal irony, a slam-bang humor, and a style of writing as balefully direct as a death sentence. O'Connor hated that review, and so many like it, typical as it was in missing the point narrowly but completely. The review in Time was terrible, nearly gave me apoplexy, she writes. And later, when I see these stories described as horror stories, I'm always amused because the reviewer always has hold of the wrong horror. And really, why shouldn't they? Her stories contain an astonishing and shockingly unpleasant array of fire-breathing creatures, freaks, murderers, psychologically disturbed youngsters, putting it mildly, perverts, prostitutes, charlatans, adulterers, uncouth rednecks, and just plain miserable heroes. These stories are brutal and violent, rife with mayhem, deceit, manipulation, cynical twists and distortions, and the death of innocent people. Hillbilly Thomist or hillbilly nihilist. To some, her work is nothing more than dark and despairing naturalism at its basest and most destructive. But this is to misconstrue her fiction and to be blind, willfully blind by some who admire her technical achievement but find her animating principle uncongenial, to be blind to her understanding of the central meaning of life, redemption in Christ. But there's a problem with such a view when her audience, the modern world, finds the whole notion of redemption meaningless, since there's nothing from which to be redeemed. She's intent on recalling to us some known but forgotten truths about our world and our existence in it. So to an audience otherwise blind and deaf to the Christian vision of life, quote, you have to make your vision apparent by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and the almost blind you draw in large and startling figures. Her stories are intended to rattle us. Where grace was operative in O'Connor's stories, writes one commentator, it was always disruptive. In its presence, one's head was supposed to explode. Tonight, my intention is a modest one. There's simply too much to be said about Flannery O'Connor to be put into an hour presentation. But I want to provide some insights into her intentions and methods for those of us who have tried or want to try to read this truly great but somewhat puzzling Catholic writer. She's been accused of being a sadist, indulging in violence and the grotesque for shock value and little more. But in fact, she was a realist, a Christian realist. And what she portrayed was in keeping with the horror she saw in contemporary life. An age unprecedented in its apostasy and blind to any positive presence of God's grace within the human and natural orders. A traditional Christian humanism will no longer suffice. At bottom, she believed that most of humanity has become so warped in its thinking and debased in its desires that it could only be depicted through grotesque and violent images. Hers was an apophatic approach, an approach to the knowledge of God through negation. She strove to show the reader the beauty of virtue by first showing the ugliness of its absence. Ultimately, her concern for the grotesque pointed to a conception of straightness or oughtness, without which the imperfect and the grotesque are meaningless. Grace must wound before it can heal, she wrote. Mary Flannery O'Connor was born March 25th, 1925, on the Feast of the Annunciation, which accounts for her first name, in Savannah, Georgia, the only child of Regina Klein O'Connor and Edward Francis O'Connor Jr., and baptized April 12th at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. They were part of the small minority community of Roman Catholics in Georgia, the great-grandfathers on both sides having emigrated from Ireland in the mid-19th century. The name Flannery was chosen to preserve the memory of Civil War Captain John Flannery from her mother's side. Mary Flannery was later to drop her first name while a graduate student at the University of Iowa, thinking it sounded more like that of an Irish washerwoman's than a writer's. Her earliest years weren't so remarkable, if not exactly conventional. She attended Catholic schools. As a little girl, she loved to draw and write stories. Growing up, she spent more time with adults than children. She could be shy and awkward around other children, but reportedly was a little forward with adults, speaking to them as equals. O'Connor being an only child, her parents, both of whom she addressed by their first names, were particularly attentive and enthused over her stories and illustrations. They encouraged her at a young age in her fondness for all kinds of domestic fowl. When she was 5, she taught a frizzled chicken, frizzled because its feathers grew backward, to walk backward, for which she received quite a lot of attention, including that of a newsreel company out of New York, Pathé News, which sent a cameraman to Savannah to film her and her chicken in action. It was shown in theaters all across America, except in Savannah for some reason. It was an experience, said O'Connor, that marked me for life. It was her high point, she said. Everything since has been an anticlimax. What had been a mild interest turned into something of a passion. She collected more and more chickens, favoring odd specimens. The memory of all that attention long fresh in her mind. I could sew in a fashion, and I began to make clothes for chickens, she writes. A gray bantam named Colonel Egbert wore a white piqué coat with a lace collar and 2 buttons in the back. This predilection for freak chickens might portend her interest in human freaks in her later stories. It's hard to say. She herself was usually dismissive of such facile conclusions. Most likely she'd say it was an effort to get some attention. In later years, she famously collected peafowl. She recounts people's reactions to the peacock lifting its tail, shaking it violently until it gradually opens into a green bronze arch of a galaxy of glazing haloed suns. This, she explains, is the moment when most people are silent. There was the time, however, when an elderly black woman cried, "Amen, amen," at the spectacle, which O'Connor found to be a suitable witness. She was something of a stinker when she was little. Probably smarter than most people around her, she was impatient with kids her age and even with adults. Some of her best characters in her stories, we should note, both children and adult, suffer keenly from intellectual pride. And she's clearly masterful at getting inside their heads, and doubtless for a good reason. Her mother, by all accounts, was overly protective. She kept a list of children Mary Flannery was allowed to play with. One friend remembers, quote, going to her house once with a little girl who was visiting me, and Mary Flannery tied her up to a chair in her bedroom. I remember my mother saying, if she acted like that, not to play with her. At school, it was customary for students to share lunches. something she resisted. One classmate remembers she brought castor oil sandwiches, so nobody would eat her lunch. She's remembered, too, for dipping snuff in class and shooting rubber bands off her braces behind the nuns' backs and occasionally sassing back. Her attitude with children coming over to play was described by one childhood friend as, "You do what I say or we don't play." The great heartbreak of her life was the early death of her father from lupus in 1941, just shy of Mary Flannery's 16th birthday. Lupus, the disease that was eventually to kill her 23 years later. She resembled her father more than her mother in their common love of storytelling and drawing, and in sharing her father's playful, artistic, and reflective temperament. His death was a blow to both mother and daughter. In a journal she kept at the time, Mary Flannery records, "The reality of death has come upon us, and a consciousness of the power of God has broken our complacency like a bullet in the side. A sense of the dramatic, of the tragic of the infinite has descended upon us, filling us with grief, but even above grief, wonder. Our plans were so beautifully laid out, ready to be carried to action, but with magnificent certainty, God laid them aside and said, 'You have forgotten mine.'" A remarkable reflection for a 15-year-old. And almost programmatic for her vision as a writer. The vanity of human wishes, as Samuel Johnson would have it, and in the inevitability of death and the rough and tumble of lived reality will inform her deeply and shape her posture toward God and the world. Before his death, Edward O'Connor moved his family in 1938 to Atlanta for employment reasons, and shortly after moved again, this time to Regina's ancestral home in Milledgeville, some 20 miles outside Atlanta. O'Connor went to Peabody High School, where she contributed some very clever cartoons and stories to the school newspaper. She eventually attended college right there in town at the Georgia State College for Women. She entered the freshman class in 1942 at 16 years of age. She graduated in 3 years, and in her time there became well known to nearly every student on campus for her talents and intelligence. Socially, she was somewhat isolated, partly because she lived off campus, and was remembered years later for her individualistic attitude. I bet she was. She was very private, but was known for her great sense of humor. After college in 1945, she left for Iowa City to study journalism on scholarship. She changed her focus almost immediately and approached Paul Engel, the director of the Writers' Workshop, about her desire to enroll. Engel reports, "She walked into my office one day and spoke to me. I understood nothing, not one syllable. My God, I thought to myself, this is a retarded young girl. Finally, I said, 'Excuse me, my name is Paul Engel.' I gave her a pad and said, 'Would you please write down what you're telling me?' And she wrote, 'My name is Flannery O'Connor. I'm from Milledgeville, Georgia. I'm a writer.' It didn't take long for Engel to be struck with what he called her pure talent. The stories, he writes, were quietly filled with insight, shrewd about human weakness, hard and compassionate. She caught the attentions of others too. Andrew Lytle, for one. Lytle was a celebrated writer and teacher, a fellow Southerner. He was immediately taken with this gifted young woman and became something of her mentor, something several of the other students, who were mostly men recently returned from the war, couldn't quite understand. One of them describing her as talking with, quote, a bale of cotton in her mouth. Lytle was aware of the low-level grousing, but was deeply impressed with this lovely girl who, quote, scared the boys to death with her irony. She was quiet, hardly saying a word in class. According to Engel, she sat silent at the back of the room, untouched by the exuberant talkers. Quote, the only communicating gesture she would make was an occasional amused and shy smile at something absurd. The dreary chair she sat in glowed, he writes. She was a loner, yet everyone respected her talent. Importantly, at Iowa, she learned to read. I didn't really start to read until I went to graduate school, and then I began to read and write at the same time. She read all the current Catholic authors, such as Mauriac, Bernanos, Blas, Green, Waugh, and then the best Southern writers such as Faulkner, Alan Tate, Catherine Ann Porter, Eudora Welty, and the Russians, such as Dostoevsky, Chekhov, and Gogol, not Tolstoy, she pointed out. She became a great admirer of Conrad. She gained a lot from Hawthorne, Flaubert, Balzac, and something from Kafka. She admired Johnson. But always, she writes, the largest thing that looms up is the humorous tales of Edgar Allan Poe. I am sure he wrote them all while drunk, too. Clearly, she read well. And for much of this period, and again later, she seemed particularly interested in the French Catholic writers of the early 20th century, people such as Bernanos and the brilliant Mauriac especially. But I was struck to see the name of Leon Blois on this list. If there was ever a living model for her most outrageous characters in her novels, it could have been Blois. Blois wasn't too unlike Old Tarwater, The Prophet in Wise Blood, her first novel. Like Tarwater, Blois turned a face of almost interstellar indignation upon the world. A penny given grudgingly to a poor man, declared Blois, pierces the poor man's hand, falls, pierces the earth, bores holes in suns, crosses the firmament, and compromises the universe. He was extreme and violent in his rhetoric. Jacques and Reza Maritain were so impressed, it should be noted, that it was through Blois that they converted to Catholicism. He was their godfather. His, quote, grandeur, simplicity, unshakable conviction, disdain of contingencies, singleness of purpose, reminded them of those sturdy and magnificent messengers of God, the Hebrew prophets. Hyperbole, Blois wrote, is a microscope for discriminating between insects and a telescope for drawing nearer to the stars. O'Connor mentions him in her prayer journal from that time. Blois has come my way. He is an iceberg hurled at me to break up my Titanic, and I hope my Titanic will be smashed. Commenting on some popular sentimental depictions of Christ, she says, these modern Christs would have made Blois wretch. The rest of us have lost our power to vomit. We're reminded by this turbocharged Catholic of a comment O'Connor makes much later to a correspondent. She's a Catholic, she writes, not like someone else would be a Baptist or a Methodist, but like someone else would be an atheist. That was worthy of Blois. After the writer's workshop, she received a fellowship to the Yaddo Artist Retreat in Saratoga Springs, New York. Set on 400 acres of woods, formal gardens, fountains, it consisted of a 55-room late Victorian Gothic mansion with 16 outlying buildings. It was bequeathed by the widow of its builder in 1926 as a center of, quote, creating, creating, creating. Many famous writers, artists, and intellectuals of all kinds passed through its doors over the years. One of her endorsers for Yaddo recommended her as, quote, a personally shy but kind and charming young Southern writer. Andrew Lyell's recommendation said that O'Connor had, quote, as much promise as anyone I have seen of her generation. She was to find Yaddo challenging. She was out of place culturally. There was a lot of self-conscious posing going on. She writes to a friend, at the breakfast table they talked about Seconal and barbiturates, and now maybe it's marijuana. You survive in this atmosphere by minding your own business and by having plenty of your own business to mind, and by not being afraid to be different from the rest of them. The parties at Yaddo were legendary. Quote, in any collection of so-called artists, you will find a good percentage alcoholic in one degree or another, wrote O'Connor. And of course, the heavy consumption led to all kinds of coupling among the guests. O'Connor decided to make friends with the Irish caretaker and head cook, who lived with their 3 kids on the property. She couldn't be a daily communicant at Yaddo like she was in Iowa and for the rest of her life after Yaddo, but she attended weekly mass with this family. It was at Yaddo that O'Connor first read and avidly studied Maritain's book, Art and Scholasticism, which her biographer describes as a thunderclap to O'Connor. She drew line markings next to the passage, do not make the absurd attempt to sever in yourself the artist and the Christian. It was at Yaddo, too, that she met the young and already celebrated poet Robert Lowell. Lowell was a strikingly handsome man, an on-again, off-again Catholic, first converting when he married the poet Jean Stafford, whom he later divorced. He was beginning even then to show signs of instability that eventually would land him in a mental hospital. But he took a strong liking for Flannery, recognizing her brilliance and feeling through her quiet faith a pull back to Catholicism. It's clear that O'Connor fell in love with Lowell, but those feelings were unrequited. He eventually married the writer and mutual friend Elizabeth Hardwick, a marriage later described by the New York Times as restless and emotionally harrowing. O'Connor surely dodged a bullet that time, and surely the only thing that could explain the photo of her completely incongruous appearance in a conga line at Yaddo was the temporary insanity of love. After a tumultuous exit from Yaddo, an exit precipitated by a big blow-up instigated by Lowell against the administrator there, O'Connor left for New York, where she moved into a $2 a day room that smelled, she said, like an unopened Bible. We Catholics know what that smells like. It was in New York City that she was introduced to Robert and Sally Fitzgerald, who were to prove to be some of her closest and most important friends, and who eventually would administer her literary estate. And equally important was her introduction to the publisher, Robert Giroux, who became her publishing mentor and champion. He remembered the introduction to O'Connor very well. It was Robert Lowell who brought her to his office. She was very quiet, said Giroux. She was very chary of words. Lowell, of course, was vocal and full of interesting phrases, a great talker. But she had electric eyes, very penetrating. She could see right through you, so to speak. I was a young publisher interested in acquiring writers. I thought, this woman is so committed as a writer, she'll do whatever she's made up her mind to do. While in New York, Robert Lowell served as O'Connor's cicerone. She later wrote of a now famous interaction, if you could call it that, with Mary McCarthy at a dinner party. I'm going to read the whole thing, it's so good. I was once, 5 or 6 years ago, taken by some friends to have dinner with Mary McCarthy and her husband, Mr. Broadwater. She just wrote the book, A Charmed Life. She departed the church at the age of 15 and is a capital B, big, capital I, intellectual. We went at 8, and at 1, I hadn't opened my mouth once, there being nothing for me in such company to say. The people who took me were Robert Lowell and his now wife, Elizabeth Hardwick. Having me there was like having a dog present who had been trained to say a few words, but overcome with inadequacy had forgotten them. Well, toward morning, the conversation turned on the Eucharist, which I, being the Catholic, was obviously supposed to defend. Mrs. Broadwater, Mary McCarthy, said when she was a child and received the host, she thought of it as the Holy Ghost, he being the most portable person of the Trinity. Now she thought of it as a symbol and implied that it was a pretty good one. I then said, in a very shaky voice, well, if it's a symbol, to hell with it. That was all the defense I was capable of, but I realize now that this is all I will ever be able to say about it outside of a story, except that it is the center of existence for me. All the rest of life is expendable. In September 1949, O'Connor accepts an invitation from the Fitzgeralds to live with them and their children as a paid guest in Ridgefield, Connecticut. It was a great and productive time for Flannery. Sally Fitzgerald tells us that she was clearly the coolest person in the house, according to the children and adults both. She established a comfortable routine of writing for 4 hours every morning and found the environment conducive to a wonderful intellectual fellowship with the Fitzgeralds, who were both writers, and Robert soon a celebrated translator of classics. In the late fall of 1950, Flannery begins to suffer discomfort in her arms and shoulders. First thoughts are that it might be arthritis. When she goes home for Christmas, she arrives desperately ill with a high fever. She's diagnosed with lupus, the disease that killed her father. She's 25, and she's home to stay. All this time, her final months in Iowa, her time at Yaddo, and then in New York City, and later in Connecticut, and then finally at home in Georgia. She's working on her first novel, Wise Blood, which was eventually published in 1952. It features a young preacher named Hazel Motes, who has heard the radical summons to preach the gospel from his grandfather, an itinerant preacher, quote, a waspish old man who had ridden over 3 counties with Jesus hidden in his head like a stinger. Motes spends the rest of his life struggling to throw off this call to preach. He's scandalized by the thought of Jesus dying and the idea of original sin. He decides that the best way to avoid Jesus and sin was to remain morally uncorrupted. So he walks around with rocks in his shoes to crucify his flesh, so to speak. He finds that maintaining purity is a hard thing to do. And then he reverses himself. If there is no God, then there's only me, and so I live for my self-satisfaction. He finds even indulgence, however, unsatisfying. So he turns to blasphemy, but realizes that all these denials are somehow parasitic on a positive truth. And so he invents his own church to espouse the gospel of nothingness, the church without Christ, where the blind don't see and the lame don't walk. The only thing he loves outside of himself is his car, an old Essex. Nobody with a good car, he says, needs to be justified. He sleeps in it, preaches in his sharp, high, nasal Tennessee voice from atop the hood, and since there is no God and all things are permitted, he runs down a man who has impersonated him. You'll have to read the story. And then a policeman pushes his car over a cliff, which brings an end to his idol. It's at this point of crisis that he arrives at the truth that there's a home outside his cramped and suffocating ego, something larger than himself, a burning mercy and a purging peace. Since he had been preaching the counter-gospel that nothing is true but one's own body, he proceeds to work out his salvation precisely there, with penance, mutilating the body he once worshipped. This time, he puts bits of broken glass in his shoes and wraps barbed wire around his chest. And then, understanding that to see everything, you must see nothing, he burns out his eyes with quicklime. From here on out, his journey will be an interior one. The summary leaves out a lot of important parts and characters, including Enoch, Sabbath Lily, a gorilla suit, and much more. But you get the drift. This is a very strange book. It had only one blurb on its cover when it released, from the author Caroline Gordon, who wrote, "Her picture of the modern world is literally terrifying. Kafka is the almost only one of our contemporaries who has achieved such effects." Such a comment caught people's attention. Kafka was very big then, but it also set her up for being misunderstood. The first line of critics, the guardians of public taste, panned it. One reviewer went so far as to say that it's a work of insanity and the writer was clearly insane. Another, though conceding that she's a writer of power, called her style tight and choking, and her novel an indefensible blow delivered in the dark. But more thoughtful reviews began to appear, including one in Newsweek that referred to her as, quote, "perhaps the most naturally gifted of the youngest generation of American novelists, and her first book, Wise Blood, has an imaginative intensity rare in any fiction these days." The central role of Protestant fundamentalism in this book, and later virtually all of her other stories, confused and continues to confuse many of her readers, both secular and Catholic. Some saw her as possibly a latter-day H.L. Mencken, famously scathing of all religion, especially Southern fundamentalism, which he mocked relentlessly. But O'Connor's view was different. She saw these self-appointed prophets and preachers as scratching and straining toward a kind of incipient sacramentalism, almost as emigres of the Old Testament, yearning with intensity for real and operative sacraments. These kinds of people, to her mind, crypto-Catholics, were fertile ground for the mercy of God. Quote, "When you leave a man alone with his Bible and the Holy Ghost inspires him, he's going to be a Catholic one way or another." She wrote in a letter in 1963, this marked synthesis of Southern fundamentalism and Catholicism was and is uniquely her own. For her, the problem with such Christians, by the way, was, quote, "on the nature of the church, not on the nature of God and our obligation to him." A do-it-yourself religion, she calls it elsewhere, which I, as a Catholic, find painful and touching and grimly comic. And of course, the violence of Wise Blood diverted a proper attention to the story. Some readers liked the violence because it felt so modern, and others hated it for being gratuitous. But O'Connor found it a necessary thing. Violence is in keeping with contemporary life, which is brutal and grotesque. The hard part is to make violence and the grotesque be seen as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural. A few readers got it, most didn't. This will be the prevailing pattern toward her entire work, with slowly more and more readers catching on. Catholics, it should be noted, being some of the more recalcitrant. In 1955, she publishes her first collection of short stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find. The title story is probably her best known. It's the most frequently anthologized. It's the story of a family of 5 plus a grandmother and her secretly stowed cat, setting out for a car trip from Georgia to Florida, a trip the grandmother doesn't want to make. She would rather visit her connections in East Tennessee. She stops at nothing to manipulate her son, Bailey, to change his mind. And in the first paragraph, we see her standing with her hand on her hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head, telling him about the escape from prison of this brutal murderer who calls himself the Misfit and that he's headed to Florida, just as they were. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did. She switches arguments abruptly and invokes the children again. You ought to take them somewhere else for a change, so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They have never been to East Tennessee. When Flannery O'Connor read the sentence during a public reading at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the audience exploded with laughter. They knew what East Tennessee amounted to. You can hear that online, it's fantastic. And a few deaf strokes were introduced to everybody. The 2 older children, the third is a baby, are sassy, especially toward their grandmother. The mother is, quote, a woman in slacks whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage. Bailey, the kid's father, is sullen and quiet. In the car on their way, the grandmother is chattering, pointing out details along the road, commenting on Bailey's speed, warning him about the wiles of patrolmen, occasionally exchanging barbs with the children. We learn that the grandmother is dressed quite formally as if going to church because, quote, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know at once that she was a lady. She's reminded of an old plantation in this very neighborhood she visited once as a young girl. She knew Bailey wouldn't want to stop, but she was curious to see if the cute little arbors were still standing. There was a secret panel in this house, she said craftily, not telling the truth, but wishing that she were. And the story went that all the family silver was hidden in it when Sherman came through, but it was never found. And of course the kids, John Wesley, who's 8, and his little sister June Starr, go berserk and hound their father to let them see the secret panel until he finally caves in. They turn around and find the dirt road, and after a while the road looks more and more untraveled and deserted. And then the horrible thought strikes the grandmother. She was mistaken. The plantation was in East Tennessee, not Georgia. At that moment, her cat, Pitty Sing, springs out of its basket and onto Bailey's shoulder, which causes Bailey to flip the car over, landing on its wheels in a ditch, the mother and baby thrown from the car. And then a black hearse-like vehicle drives up with 3 men in it. The grandmother had the peculiar feeling, we're told, that the bespectacled man who got out of it was someone she knew. His face was as familiar to her as if she had known him all her life, but she could not recall who he was. And then she recognizes him. You're the Misfit. I recognized you at once. The Misfit then has his men take each one of the family into the woods and shoot them one by one. The grandmother is last and tries every contrivance conceivable to stay his hand, suggesting that he's in fact a good man. And if he'd only pray to Jesus, Jesus would help him. That's right, the Misfit said. Well, then why don't you pray, she asked. I don't want no help, he said. I'm doing all right by myself. There were 2 more pistol reports, and the grandmother raised her head like a parched old turkey hen crying for water and called, Bailey boy, as if her heart would break. Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the Misfit says, and he shouldn't have done it. He'd thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody, or burning down his house, or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said, and his voice had become almost a snarl. The grandmother, with all cylinders firing and understandably desperate, is quick to throw Jesus over if it would make any difference. Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the old lady mumbled. The misfit, the good rationalist that he is, refuses to believe anything that can't be verified empirically. And so agitated is he at the thought of Jesus raising the dead that he hits his fist to the ground, and in a high voice about to crack, he cries, "If I had have been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now." And then we read, the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, "Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children." At which point she touches his shoulder and he shoots her 3 times in the chest. We last see her half sitting, half lying in a puddle of blood, quote, with her legs crossed under her like a child's, and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. A story really isn't any good unless it successfully resists paraphrase, unless it hangs on and expands in the mind, O'Connor once said. But she gives us an important key when she wrote about what makes a story work, particularly her stories. What's needed is, quote, some action, some gesture of a character that is unlike any other in the story, one which indicates where the real heart of the story lies. This would have to be an action or a gesture which was both totally right and totally unexpected. It would have to be one that was both in character and beyond character. It would have to suggest both the world and eternity. The action or gesture I'm talking about would have to be on the anagogical level, that is, the level which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it. It would be a gesture that transcended any neat allegory that might have been intended, or any pat moral categories a reader could make. It would be a gesture which somehow made contact with mystery. About this story, she said that, quote, "It should elicit from you a degree of pity and terror, even though its way of being serious is a comic one." The story starts off with lighthearted squabbling. This is typical of O'Connor's humor. It's a kind of dramatic strategy where she begins with familiar surface interactions, a domestic farce. And then at the critical turn, the natural becomes metaphysical. And it happens with a surprise and with a grim humor, no matter how shocking. And the humor doesn't disappear, right up to the end, and this is important. The mundane, the trivial, and the absurd present themselves in a strange kind of comedy, even as we hear pistol shots in the dark wood. The grandmother is babbling on about the weather and good families and how one ought not to shoot a lady, while the misfit meditates on the meaning of Christ raising the dead while holding a gun to her head. And to O'Connor, the humor is appropriate. Why? Because the grotesque is a commentary on not only man's presumption, but also of his sheer folly in trying to live on any terms other than God's, both sinful and silly. The story is grotesque. It's not how we understand stories of such serious intent, such as tragedy, proceed. It breaks the rules, at least the conventional rules. "I don't think life is a tragedy," she once wrote. "Tragedy is something which can be explained by the professors." It is in keeping, however, with the theme central to the Christian mysteries of the Incarnation and the sacramental imagination. The quality of transcendence, a character's virtues, passion, and pain, is not lifted out of their bodies, but is grounded in immanence and sits side by side with the patent absurdities of a fallen world. O'Connor was never satisfied in softening appearances and in creating unearthly representation of Christian holiness. Her main task, she believed, was to show the operation of grace in the lives of ordinary people, with, as she put it in a letter, all their hypocrisy and humanity and banality. Some early interpreters of a good man, it's hard to find, insisted that the grandmother was evil, a witch, what with her cat and all. But when taught this way in the context of the Southern classroom, as reported to O'Connor, the students wouldn't have it. They all had grandmothers or aunts just like her. She wasn't altogether bad, and would appear at times to speak from a good heart, much like the rest of us. But day to day, hour to hour, much like the rest of us, practically she was an atheist. The misfit is religiously the most interesting figure in this story. There's a sense in which he's the only really morally serious person. A former Baptist and gospel singer, he's a fundamentalist nihilist. He understands the ultimate issue. He understands what's at stake, and he's made his decision. He knows the final alternatives are not science and religion, but belief and nihilism. And in acting on his nihilism, he's not tempted by anything so petty as theft. He murders instead of robs. Nobody has nothing I want, he tells her. To even steal would acknowledge a good other than his self-will. He delights instead in acts of annihilation, murder, arson, and cruelty, expressions of his brutal will to power. There's nothing lukewarm about this man. He isn't embarrassed by the supernatural, he's scandalized by it. He's outraged at what he knows the choice to be. Jesus was either God incarnate or a complete fraud. No room for Jesus the prophet or Jesus the ethical teacher. There's a telling contrast here between the killer haunted by the person of Christ and the grandmother who, in a desperate moment, discards Christ to stay alive, who sees Christ as little more than a garment to be taken on or off, another accessory to a lady's dress who might perchance be found dead on the side of the road. The desperate moment to O'Connor is always revelatory. In her stories, violence can reveal those qualities which are all that we'll have to take with us into eternity. With the serious writer, she says, violence is never an end in itself. It is the extreme situation that best reveals what we are essentially. And violence can also serve as a precondition for grace. In my stories, she writes, I have found that violence is strangely capable of returning my characters to reality and preparing them to accept their moment of grace. Their heads are so hard, she continues, that almost nothing else will work. This idea that reality is something to which we must be returned at considerable cost is one which is seldom understood by the casual reader, but it is one which is implicit in the Christian view of the world. So the incursion of grace happens at the very end. The supreme irony in this story is that unbeknownst to him, the misfit serves as a vehicle of God's grace. God, who can write straight with crooked lines, is offering himself to her, the grandmother, through this moral monster, a devilish and terrifying character who has just murdered her family. God is offering her the charity of grace that a responding charity can gain for her. In my stories, O'Connor wrote, a reader will find that the devil accomplishes a good deal of groundwork that seems to be necessary before grace is effective. All of a sudden, in extremity, the grandmother sees a certain essential kinship with the misfit. And in an act of mutual identification, she touches him. She drops all of her self-justification, her desperation to live at any cost, and sees a brother in sin. Both need grace. That feeling of familiarity when she first saw him, was it more than her memory of the photograph? Was it perhaps herself she recognized? She had long lived by her own lights, which proved too dim to reveal her sinfulness. The universe, she seemed to say, with her life is going to come to heel. Painful self-knowledge is necessary to recognize the gospel. She really is the portrait of the average Christian soul, manipulating, compromising, and deceiving its way through ordinary life. She's one of us. The misfit dare not confess this shared sinfulness. That's why he shot her. That and a warped but consoling notion of his own heroism that won't let him abide the touch of her ordinary humanity. To concede sin is to turn to Christ, which would make demands on his life that he refuses to submit to, being in his own estimation the exceptional man that he is. She, on the other hand, dies a good death. She dies in a state of grace. We're given a clue by the childlike, comical posture of her body when she's dead and the half-imbecilic face transfigured, smiling up at the cloudless sky. Like Dante, O'Connor mocks the self-delusionary heroism of the damned and extols poor, stupid, ordinary people who say yes to God. There's a slight indication, too, that the misfit was touched by grace when he wipes his glasses after he shoots her and makes the judgment, meaning, suggests O'Connor in one of her letters, that she'd have been a good woman if he had been there every minute of her life. One can almost sense, even as decidedly evil as he is, a kind of magnetic allurement to the grace of God. All my stories, she explains to a friend in a letter, are about the action of grace on a character who is not very willing to support it. But most people think of these stories as hard, hopeless, brutal. And that pretty much describes much of her reading public, marked as it is by profound unbelief, and yet strangely attracted by the violence and apparent darkness of what it sees as a quintessentially brutal realism. But O'Connor described herself as a Christian realist, which some people see as two incompatible concepts. Orthodox Christianity, they say, can't deal with the real world. She was impatient with this view. Syllogistically, if Christianity is true, and if the method of modern novelists was to put as much truth as possible in the novel, then by this very fact, the modern novel was that which is best suited to Christianity. A Christian realism will find in it the exact truth of humanity's nature. Her stories and characters are authentic and universal, not so much because she realistically describes the outward experiences of herself and her community, but because she ruthlessly pierces through the exterior shell to a common ground of human need, pain, and expectation. Both the naturalist and the Christian realist breathe the same common air, the nausea of ugliness, but they attribute different significances to this single factual perception. Only the visionary, said the French critic Émile Beaumont, the contemplative, or the artist with faith are capable of seeing the, quote, infinite converging in the poor spark of our lives, as he put it. This idea of the infinite converging in the poor spark of our lives is critical and at the heart of Flannery O'Connor's sense of realism, her sacramental view of all of existence. She never pretended to be a philosopher or an intellectual in the academic sense, but she was brilliant, reflective, and articulate, and had a firm sense of her vocation as a writer. She coined the phrase hillbilly Thomist in reference to herself. She reads selections from the Summa for at least 20 minutes each night in bed. If my mother, she writes to a friend, were to come in during this process and say, "Turn off that light, it's late," I, with lifted finger and broad, bland, beatific expression, would reply, "On the contrary, I answer that the light, being external and limitless, cannot be turned off. Shut your eyes." But her single most important source for thinking deeply about her art and her Catholicism was St. Thomas as filtered through Jacques Maritain's book, Art and Scholasticism. From Thomas via Maritain, O'Connor learns to identify a salient flaw in much of modern thinking in its reduction of reality, in separating reason from imagination, judgment from vision, and nature from grace. This last particularly important to the sacramental imagination. Their complementarity, she would contend, means a larger understanding of reality. For her, reason and imagination are necessary aspects of a fundamental gift, being, existence itself. And she understands, too, that grace doesn't destroy nature, but completes it and perfects it. She wants to recover, in the face of the absence of God in the secular world, the divine presence that is sacramentally at work in all things. All creation, in all its forms, possesses sacramental potential. The world of matter is an entry into God's mysteries. And she learns from Maritain that creation is something given. It's not a projection from the artist's ego or imagination. Unlike the existentialist, the artist's work is a secondary act of creation, secondary in the sense of being an imitation, not of nature, but of the creative activity of nature, and rooted in an understanding of the gift of being, including the very being of the artist herself, is her understanding that the artist approaches reality with a certain piety, because all creation is creaturely. That is, its being depends upon the prime creator, God. What this means is that every writer must be responsible to the things he sees. This is realism, minding closely the particularities of the immediate world and with a careful respect for craftsmanship. The artist will necessarily reflect, whether consciously intending to or not, something larger than the immediate world. Quote, "The longer you look at one object," writes O'Connor, "the more of the world you see in it." And it's well to remember that the serious fiction writer always writes about the whole world, no matter how limited his particular scene. The author's obligation is to the truth of what he sees and what can happen in life, and not to the reader. This is very foreign to me in publishing. We always think that a book, and on our level of publishing, a book does have to serve a reader. But that's not her idea. It's not to serve the reader, not to serve the reader's taste, happiness, or even morals. She writes, The writer, whose point of view is Catholic, reads nature in the same way the medieval commentators read Scripture, read Scripture. They found three levels of meaning in the literal level of the sacred text: the allegorical, in which one thing stands for another; the moral, which has to do with what should be done; and the anagogical, which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it, the level of grace. In her fiction, she isn't interested in a message or in ethics. You'll find nothing ethical in her stories, but in the mystery of belief. After being diagnosed with lupus, the blow she felt most keenly, even more than the prospect of a debilitating illness, was her forced return to her native Georgia. That struck her as the true death sentence. It would mean the end of her writing. It would stifle her creativity by robbing her of a critical distance she felt she needed to write about the South and escape its small-minded provincialism. And she feared being smothered by her mother, too, a legitimate fear. She later liked to say that her designated function at her mother's tea parties was to cover up the stain on the sofa. But it turns out that she and her mother grew very close. And more than once, Flannery told friends how wonderful and indispensable her mother was to her. Her personal triumph over her confinement was impressive, and even when death was close at hand, O'Connor resisted all self-pity. When someone suggested that her pain was to be compared with Christ's, she would have none of it. I haven't suffered to speak of in my life, and I don't know any more about the redemption of suffering than anybody else, she said. Eventually, she was able to pay a shining tribute to her mother and her home. The best of my writing has been done here. It took her experience up north, I suppose, to help her realize how sympathetic and drawn to the South she was. Most Southerners, for all their faults, still took seriously the God whom the smarter secular world dismissed. The South wasn't Christ-centered, she said, but it was Christ-haunted. But more importantly, it was where she was from. She once commented after a New York dinner party that none of the people there was from anywhere. She later warned about the danger to the balance between principle and fact, judgment and observation for those living outside their homeland. Limitations, even the apparent limitation of Georgia, was to her a gateway to reality. She's Chestertonian this way. She explains, it is not a matter of so-called local color. It is not a matter of losing our peculiar quaintness. Southern identity is not really connected with mockingbirds and beaten biscuits and white columns any more than it is with bookworm and bare feet and muddy clay roads. And identity is not to be found on the surface. It is not made from the mean, average, or typical, but from the hidden and often the most extreme. It is not made from what passes, but from those qualities that endure, regardless of what passes, because they are related to truth. It lies very deep. In its entirety, it is known only to God, but of those who look for it, none gets so close as the artist. In her 14 years of illness, she was still able to travel and lecture at a wide variety of venues, from women's literary societies to university campuses. She received several honorary degrees. She liked to poke fun at her own slight status in popular culture, and once when a friend accused her of being a celebrity, she responded that her fame was, quote, a comic distinction shared with Roy Rogers' horse in Miss Watermelon of 1955. At the end of 1963, she suffers from anemia and faints and is confined to bed for a week. In the following February, it's discovered that her anemia is caused by a fibroid tumor. And even though the risk is great, it's successfully removed. In the course of the spring, she grows weaker from infections and the reactivation of her lupus, and spends time in and out of the hospital, all the while preparing a draft for the publication of a new collection of stories that will eventually be called Everything That Rises Must Converge, her best collection. She receives transfusions and cortisone treatments, but is unable to regain her strength. She hides unfinished stories beneath her pillow for fear of being forbidden to write. She eventually returns home and works 2 hours a day at the typewriter. On July 7th, she receives the sacrament of the sick from her parish priest and continues to revise her manuscript until she drops from exhaustion in late July. She learns that her story, Revelation, won the O. Henry Award. And then she enters the hospital. On August 2nd, she slips into a coma and dies of kidney failure shortly after midnight on August 3rd. She's buried the next day beside her father in Memory Hill Cemetery in Milledgeville. In November 2013, Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal was published, comprised of entries in a devotional notebook she kept from January 1946 to September 1947, when she was 21 and 22 years old and a student at the Iowa Writers' Workshop. It is, said one reviewer, a miraculous and rather terrifying document, both a blueprint for her fiction and a prophetic dreaming out of her life's purpose and pattern. The first entry contains this entreaty that would come to characterize the profound self-abandonment and surrender underlying her keen literary ambition to be, as she pleads to God elsewhere in this journal, nothing but the instrument for your story. I want very much to succeed in the world with what I want to do. I have prayed to you about this with my mind and my nerves on it, and strung my nerves into a tension over it, and said, oh God, please, and I must, and please, please. Let me henceforth ask you with resignation, realizing that this frenzy is caused by an eagerness for what I want and not a spiritual trust. I do not wish to presume. I want to love. And then later she writes this, Dear Lord, please make me want you. It would be the greatest bliss. Not just to want you when I think about you, but to want you all of the time, to think about you all the time, to have the want driving in me, to have it like a cancer in me. It would kill me like a cancer, and that would be the fulfillment. Oh Lord, please make the dead desire living, living as it will probably have to live in suffering. I feel too mediocre now to suffer. If suffering came to me, I would not even recognize it. Lord, keep me. Mother, help. Knowing of her suffering and death from lupus at the age of 39, we are fairly shocked by this last prayer and somewhat uncomfortable with the thought that it would seem to have been fulfilled in her truly extraordinary literary accomplishment, her life and subsequent death. But can we make such a presumption about her illness and grace? Dare we? O'Connor herself would seem to think so. Writing after having lived with lupus for some 5 years, she says, I have never been anywhere but sick. In a sense, sickness is a place, more instructive than a long trip to Europe. And it's always a place where there's no company, where nobody can follow. Sickness before death is a very appropriate thing. And I think those who don't have it miss one of God's mercies. The mystery of faith's utter givenness enabled O'Connor, says Ralph Wood, to regard her disease as a strange blessing. Without it, she came to see her life might have been a massive act of presumption. Through confinement that illness forced upon her, she was able to prepare for the death which, in her Catholic view, is the most important occasion that life offers a Christian. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God, says Holy Scripture. There is an interaction between man and God which to disregard is an act of insolence, wrote Abraham Joshua Heschel. In a letter, O'Connor wrote, It's not a matter in these stories of do unto others. That can be found in any ethical culture series. It is the fact of the Word made flesh. Unapologetic, unaccommodating, with an urgent intensity, even an ordered ferocity. Grotesque because life without grace is grotesque. She wrote for an unbelieving world. Her fiction is Christian in a new and startling way which shocks and pains many of her readers still. That's okay, she tells us. I can wait 50 years, 100 years for it to be understood, she wrote. It'll take a while for people to see what I mean. Her confidence to communicate the most important truth in the world was part of her humility, born of a deep and powerful faith. The perfection of her craft was the call of her vocation. Her extraordinary and sometimes brutal strength as a writer sprung from a unique purity and gentleness of spirit. Flannery O'Connor leaves behind her work a compelling witness to the beauty of the relentless, comic violence of grace, to the terrible speed of mercy.
Wow. Thank you. Where are you, Steve? Yeah. Questions? We've got about 5 minutes before we wrap up, but sometimes there's questions, and I want to afford that opportunity. Does anyone have a question for Steve? Yeah, Dr. Mose.
Sure. I'm just curious if she ever read or reacted to Dorothy Sayers' reflections about literature, especially the mind of the maker business and all.
Steve, do you want to use the microphone?
Yeah, could you give a quick repeat of the question and then the mic goes for the tape?
Mark, what was the question? You got it? Okay, that's good.
He asked if she ever referred to, made reference to, or read any of Dorothy L. Sayers, a great writer, work on the act of creation, the mind of the maker. Was one of her great books. Not that I read everything that I could find, I mean all her letters, everything. No, she didn't. She read some of C.S. Lewis, I think, but she was particularly touched in her earliest days with Mauriac and again those French realists, and later with Baron von Hugel, theologically anyway, and Teilhard de Chardin. She thought Chardin was brilliant and holy, and his story is remarkable. I've always had a little bit of suspicion toward him, mostly because of the people who liked him. Not that I've read anything by him, but that's how I do things. But she was impressed because he seemed to want to, again, transcend that issue of science and religion. She seemed to, she thought he went deeper. But anyway, that's off the point. No, she never refers to Dorothy L. Sayers. Both of them were tough. That would have been an interesting meeting, actually.
Thank you again, Steve. If I were to, I know you kind of alluded to this in your talk, but if you were to give us maybe 3 to 5 stories, which are like, oh, if you got to start somewhere, start there, what would they be?
That's easy. Parker's Back, a remarkable story. Talk about nature and grace. It's the man's wife, Parker's wife, is a fundamentalist who is so fundamental that she believes church is idolatry. Revelation. It's a great story where this woman comes into the doctor's waiting room there. She takes in measure everybody, mostly by looking at their shoes first, and she makes judgments, awful judgments. Oh, I won't go into it. It's hilarious, but it's stunning. I didn't bring it out well enough, but Flannery O'Connor is hilarious. She is extremely funny, and that's one of the part of her genius is to get you shuddering and laughing at the same time. She's brilliant at that, and humor is extremely important. I think I alluded to the fact I didn't use these words, but humor is sort of a metaphysical insight of sorts with her. But and there's others. Her last collection of stories, Everything That Rises Must Converge, is her superior writing. That's really her best, I think. Not everything she wrote was great. Not everything works, but most of it does. I speak as an enthusiast. I'm not an expert, but I love that woman. Any other questions? Yes?
Tell us something a little more about this Blah fellow who was so influential in her youth.
Well,
Never heard
yes.
of him.
Oh, he's remarkable. Thank you for asking
How do you
that.
spell his name?
B-L-O-Y. Leon Blah. He wrote a book called The Woman Who Was Poor. which some people thought at the time was the greatest modern French novel. Other people thought he was a monstrous fraud. He would say things like, "A rich man is a poor man who has failed." He believed the poor to be literally God's chosen people. Why? Because of the incarnation, the greatest act of poverty conceivable. He wasn't interested in progress or political solutions. He believed the poor were necessary. He was poor. He lost 2 children to poverty. I think he was a bit nuts. But God speaks through asses. No, I take that back because Blas has become one of my heroes. I think he's a fascinating man. Pope Francis quoted him in one of his first public statements. But Blas is worth investigating. And his impact on people like, not just Maritans, he brought other intellectuals to faith as well. But yes, that look of interstellar indignation. He had this ferocious mustache and these eyes that bugged out, and he was angry constantly, but angry at the right things usually. Anyway, I recommend him. I think he's outrageous. Thank you.